Welcome to Shadow Fable. Don't forget to subscribe. Martin's nights began with the ringing, a deep metallic tone cutting through the quiet of his modest suburban home. It was 11:13 p.m. on a rain-soaked evening in 1993, and the phone's sudden chime startled him awake. Since his wife's passing 2 years ago, the silence had been both a companion and a tormentor. Now, this inexplicable call broke the veil of darkness with an unsettling insistence. He hesitated before answering, his voice hesitant as it carried through the receiver. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm, precise, and disturbingly neutral. "Mr. Carver, this is the census office. We are updating our records. May I ask you a few questions?" Its tone bore no warmth, merely a measured cadence that mimicked routine business calls. But something in the quiet rhythm of the questions, and in the manner in which it delivered inquiries about his neighbor's routines and habits, set his nerves on edge. In the days that followed, the calls became a nightly ritual. Each call carried a new set of probing questions, queries about the local grocer's precise shopping times, the exact bedtime of the residents 2 houses down, and even more intimate details of the lives he scarcely knew. At first, Martin dismissed it as a bureaucratic error, a misdialed line perhaps. Yet, the growing specificity of the inquiries gnawed at him. Every detail, no matter how trivial, felt like a fragment of a puzzle he was forced to assemble, piece by disturbing piece. In the dim glow of his study, flickering from an aging desk lamp, Martin began poring over handwritten notes. He mapped the questions, correlating them with odd behaviors exhibited by his neighbors during casual encounters. The woman next door, usually reticent and polite, now seemed unnervingly precise in her responses, and even more guarded when he mentioned the calls. The elderly man from across the street, once jovial and carefree, now kept peering over his shoulder as though expecting someone, or something, to materialize out of the darkness at any moment. The atmosphere of the neighborhood had changed imperceptibly at first, like the slow shift of tectonic plates beneath concrete sidewalks. But soon, the cracks became unmistakable. A local deli owner, whose shop had always been a beacon of warm community chatter, now reserved his greetings to curt nods. Conversations that once bristled with idle small talk were now suspended in fearful pauses. Martin's observations began to fill his notebooks with patterns that revealed a disturbing manipulation, like the invisible hand of an unseen census taker rearranging the normal flow of life. Late one rainy night, as the wind howled outside and the streetlights danced in watery reflections on dark pavement, Martin mustered the courage to confront his neighbor, Harold, a quiet man with a kind but pained expression. They met at the dim entrance to a deserted parking lot, cars parked haphazardly under the glare of a flickering street lamp. "Harold, have you noticed things changing?" Martin asked, voice low and cautious. Harold's eyes flickered nervously as he glanced around. "Changing? I suppose the neighbors are acting off, aren't they? Like they're not quite themselves anymore." His tone oscillated between confession and fear, the weight of an unspoken secret evident in the tremor of his words. "I thought it was just me." The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Martin with more questions than answers. At home, he pored over old newspapers, researching any instance of similar phenomena, cases where official records or mundane processes crossed into the realm of the uncanny. There were whispers in obscure true crime cases and conspiracy theories suggesting that small governmental offices had once been involved in experimental psychological manipulations. Though nothing concrete emerged, those fragmented accounts resonated with the cold precision of the nightly calls. As weeks melted into a brooding winter of uncertainty, A subtle transformation began to haunt Martin's dreams, and later, his waking life. He started losing small recollections of his own past. The name of his favorite childhood friend, once vivid in his memory, slipped away like fog retreating at dawn. Faces in the neighborhood acquired an uncanny air of impersonality, as though they were actors performing roles in a script he didn't recall writing. The interplay of memory and reality, once firm and undeniable, seemed to unravel beneath the relentless march of those calls. One evening, as the rain's relentless tapping clashed with the steady rhythm of his troubled thoughts, Martin answered the phone with a tremor in his hand. "Yes?" he whispered, barely daring to voice the anxiety that had become his constant companion. "Mr. Carver, when was the last time you spoke to your neighbor, Mrs. Ellison?" The query echoed in his mind like a shard of broken glass. Mrs. Ellison, a kindly soul who'd always greeted him with a tentative smile, had recently become reclusive, keeping her curtains drawn and her responses curt when encountered on brief, chance meetings. The specificity of the question made Martin's blood run cold. That night, driven by a need to confront the bizarre evidence of his own disintegration, Martin slipped into the drizzle-soaked streets. Beneath the pallid glow of lampposts, the neighborhood revealed itself in twisted shadows. In one abandoned house, he paused before a cracked window where Mrs. Ellison's pale silhouette could be seen. The fleeting glimpse of her eyes, wide with an emotion he could no longer decipher, spoke of unspeakable secrets. Had she been altered in the same subtle yet irrevocable way as everyone else? Back in his own home, the phone's omnipresent ring returned with regularity. Each call, each question, was a reminder that his life was being systematically redrawn. He started to correlate the questions with unsettling incidents. A neighbor who once complained of minor forgettable nuisances was now locked in his apartment, not answering calls. Another, known for his mild manner and low spirits, had begun to exhibit symptoms reminiscent of severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Counting, organizing, and fixating on minute details with ritualistic precision. At times, Martin wondered whether the calls were a product of his crumbling psyche. Was he inventing these bizarre sequences to cope with his grief? The uncertainty seeded a dangerous introspection, a self-examination of doubts that gnawed at his core. But the tangible changes in the world around him kept his suspicions firmly planted in the realm of conspiracy and manipulation, not merely delusions. The world, it seemed, was quietly being reconstructed by the steady cadence of inquiries that troubled his nights. One chill evening, as Martin sat in his study poring over his notes, a new question flashed on the phone's screen. "Mr. Carver, do you remember the color of the door that Mr. Langley installed last summer?" It was absurd in its attention to a detail that should have been trivial, an insignificant fact in the mundane routine of life. Yet it was precisely this absurdity that fractured Martin's sense of sanity. Slowly, he combed through his memory, unable to recall such trivial alterations, and found instead a gnawing emptiness where once vivid recollections had lain. The situation escalated when Martin noticed that some neighbors had begun interacting with him in a way that blurred the boundaries of his reality. Harold, his once gentle confidant, began to question Martin's recollections with an eerie precision. "Are you sure you remember it correctly? I'm afraid our memories seem to diverge these days." Such moments left Martin questioning not only his perception of others, but also his grasp on his own identity. In a desperate bid for clarity, Martin ventured to check with the local census bureau, a dim government office smeared with the grime of bureaucratic neglect. The sterile corridors, lit by flickering fluorescent lights, did nothing to comfort him. Within these walls, Rows of outdated filing cabinets and musty paper records harbored secrets of their own. A bureaucrat, whose indifferent eyes met Martin's pleading gaze for answers, merely apologized that the records had been updated under new protocols. The term protocol rang hollow in Martin's ears, a coded word that masked something far more sinister. As the rain drummed on the city's pavements and the isolation of suburban life revealed its hidden undercurrents, Martin's internal monologue began to take a darker turn. He questioned if he was, himself, an unwitting subject of a grand experiment, a trial in which the caller, that unyielding voice from the phone, was the arbiter of a new social order. Every inquiry felt like a calculated experiment, observing human behavior under the strain of systematic recollection erasure and controlled memory insertion. His nightmares began to echo the cadence of the calls, sinister voices asking him questions in fragmented echoes while he wandered endless corridors of shadow and doubt. In these dreams, he saw fragments of his past life splintering apart like pages torn from a ledger, each fragment marked with a question he couldn't answer. The line between reality and delusion blurred until he found it increasingly difficult to discern the two. One particularly stormy night, as thunder rolled across the sky like distant artillery, Martin sat at his cluttered desk, his notebook open to a page filled with frantic scribbles and crossed-out phrases. The phone rang again, its tone resonating with a cold inevitability. This time, the voice asked, "Mr. Carver, do you regret your choices?" The question was not about census details this time. It was personal, probing at the deepest crevices of his soul. In that moment, memories of guilt, loss, and regret merged with the fear of being manipulated. The line between accountability and victimhood had become tortuously blurred. He recalled a segment on a true crime documentary he'd once seen, about a covert government project to control behavior through subtle, psychological means. Although the veracity of the project had always been questioned, the vivid portrayal of its implications had unsettled him then. Now, as he listened to the gentle but accusatory cadence of the census operator's voice, Martin could not shake the feeling that he, too, was a cog in a vast shadowy machine. In the ensuing days, with the oppressive weight of paranoia bearing down on him, Martin's interactions with the outside world grew more fraught. His attempts to reach out to friends were met with estrangement or polite but vague assurances that nothing was wrong. Every familiar face on the street bore the faint glimmer of uncertainty, as if they too were haunted by invisible interrogations. Even the local newspaper, usually a source of mundane updates, carried oblique references to unexplained behavioral shifts in the community. A subtle nod, perhaps, to the very experiment unfolding in real time. One quiet afternoon, the gray light filtering through winter clouds, Martin took a solitary drive along the back roads of the neighborhood. His car's engine hummed low against the stillness of freshly fallen snow. At a red light, he caught a glimpse of Mr. Langley, a reclusive man whose newly installed front door, a striking shade of cerulean, had been a subject of one of the operator's questions. Mr. Langley stared blankly out the window, his eyes distant, as if he were waiting for an answer he couldn't provide. In that brief encounter, Martin felt the crushing weight of a shared and unspoken destiny, a fated puzzle piece in a grim, collective design that none could escape. Back at home, Martin's mind reeled with a desperate clarity born of too much introspection. Each phone call became a summons not just for information, but for a reckoning with his own existence. The dread that had once crept at the edges of his awareness now flooded his thoughts, mirroring the relentless patter of rain against his windows. Somewhere, deep within him, was the quiet knowledge that his life was not entirely his own. Each recollection, each moment of joy or despair, was being cataloged and perhaps even controlled by an unseen force. On the final night that Martin could remember before the unraveling reached its inevitable climax, the phone rang one last time. In the dim-lit solitude of his living room, he answered with trembling resignation. The voice, as implacable as ever, posed one final, fateful query. "Mr. Carver, have you ever wished you could forget the past?" In that instance, time slowed to a crawl. Martin felt a searing emptiness, a gap where cherished memories and painful regrets collided in a shattering void. His heart pounded as the realization dawned on him that forgetting might be the only salvation from this slow, systematic rewriting of his life. As the call ended, the oppressive night deepened, and Martin sat alone in the silence, a man caught between the echo of his own memories and the incalculable void of unknown manipulations. The unanswered questions lingered, heavy as the rain, as the dark truth emerged in the chiaroscuro of his mind. In the labyrinth of his existence, every recollection and every choice was now a casualty of a precision so cold and calculated that free will itself seemed an illusion. With that final, unheeding ring of the phone, the grim design of fate closed in around him, leaving him to confront not only the unraveling of his neighbors, but the disintegration of his very self. In the ensuing months, whispers spread through the neighborhood, half-truths and furtive glances that spoke of a new order, a community recalibrated by questions that no longer sought to count inhabitants, but to count souls. Martin's life had become an unwitting experiment in psychological manipulation, a reminder that in the quiet darkness behind closed doors, even the mundane could conceal a conspiracy of such depths that escape felt impossible. The calls persisted, a cold metronome against the ticking clock of fate, forever measuring the moments lost to the relentless passage of time. And so, amid the rain, the shadowed cul-de-sac, and the quietly forsaken lives, the legacy of the caller endured. A relentless, unyielding query that redefined not only the neighborhood, but the fragile boundaries of human identity. Martin, like his neighbors, had become an anomaly, recorded in an ever-expanding ledger of control. His struggle for truth trapped in a cycle of questions that left no room for escape or redemption. In the end, the dreadful truth was undeniable. Memory, identity, and fate were all subject to the cold, clinical query of a distant, unfathomable voice, a voice that had rewritten life itself, one question at a time.